Right now, you might be finding yourself doing a little bit of roster maintenance for your dynasty team and wondering between a couple guys, well, I don't think these guys have trade value necessarily. So, should I be dropping them and just creating an open spot for my next draft pick? And I want to go through some guys today that I think there are still hope for, and I don't think you should be dropping them just yet. So, make sure to go down there and drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel to show your support because this still is a very new channel for Dynasty Fantasy football. Now, I want to start out by going through the running backs first because I think there's quite a few that we can get to and that a lot of people have lost confidence in, and they've definitely lost trade value. So the first guy I want to talk about is my boy Trey Benson. So Trey Benson is obviously a guy who many people have seen the talent with him, like myself, because I really like Trey Benson coming out of college, but I think a lot of people are on the opposite side of that where it's like, yeah, I'm not really surprised he hasn't done much. I think when you put it into context though, and everything has to be put into context with a guy who has missed a bunch of time with injury, and Trey Benson in his rookie year, yeah, he was the backup to James Conner and he didn't look that great on the whole season necessarily, but at the end of his rookie year, he definitely started to figure it out. I think a light switch kind of flipped off in Trey Benson's head and he was able to be more efficient in those last 8 games or so. And then coming into this year, I think many of us saw actually a much bigger role for Trey Benson. And even when James Conner was still in the lineup, he was on the field basically at a 50-50 split. Sometimes he was even in for more snaps than James Conner was. So it was apparent to me and to anybody watching, the Arizona Cardinals wanted to get Trey Benson more involved. Now what happened ultimately, James Conner goes down, Trey Benson gets a shot. It was one game against the Seattle Seahawks, brutal defense. He didn't do that great, and then we didn't see him again. So I think at this point, a lot of people are just built up frustration with Trey Benson. And I get it. Trey Benson was my guy for me personally. And I really do think I might be biased in telling you guys to hold him. But think about what you paid to get Trey Benson. He was probably, for most people, either a late first-round pick in Dynasty rookie drafts or an early second-round pick. At that point, you cannot get that kind of value in return from Benson. And with James Conner at 30 years old and coming off another major injury, I wouldn't be surprised if Trey Benson is the lead back moving forward. So I think for me, I would hold on to him unless they go out and get a free agent running back for him to take over and Trey Benson to be basically a career backup. Now, Braylon Allen's the next guy I want to go through here. And I think with Braylon Allen, I think when you look at Breece Hall, right? Breece Hall was obviously very underwhelming for the last 2 years for the New York Jets. And they're the Jets. You can't put that all on Breece Hall. And I think with Braylon Allen in particular, obviously being behind Breece Hall was not going to do him any favors. But I really like Braylon Allen from a dynasty perspective because if you look at the guy, he's very young. He came out of college at a very young age. So he's still at a ripe age of 22 years old right now, coming into his 3rd NFL season. Also, Breece Hall might be leaving the New York Jets here soon. So if he is in fact leaving the Jets, Braylon Allen could be the next man up in that backfield. And I know a lot of people may have forgotten about it because he, like Trey Benson, spent most of the year on the injured reserve because he had a knee injury very early in the season that he was not able to come back from. But I do ultimately think if Breece Hall moves on, the Jets have so many other needs from the draft and from free agency that running back probably isn't at the top of their list, and they might just roll with Braylon Allen. So for that reason, you may have a starting running back on your hands on your bench that I would not want to cut ties with just yet. Dylan Samson of the Cleveland Browns, I think is very interesting to hold on to. So Dylan Samson was a 4th-round pick for the Cleveland Browns this past year, and obviously with Kevin Stefanski being gone, a lot of people may view it as a downgrade moving to Todd Monken. But I think the big thing with Todd Monken is that he, if you look at the last several years with the Ravens, what was he known for? Taking Derrick Henry off the field and not giving him the rock enough, particularly in 2025, because he wanted to preserve Derrick Henry, and he was giving the ball to guys like Keaton Mitchell. He was giving the ball to Rasheen Ali. He was giving the ball to a bunch of different guys. So I do think that Quinshon Judkins coming off this injury, they're going to be a little bit more cautious with him. And I think Dylan Samson could start out the year very well as the starter because we know they're done with Jerome Ford. I think at this point, it's Dylan Samson who is the clear backup and may not even be a true backup. He may, in his first year with Todd Monken, with Quinshon Judkins recovering from that injury that he suffered, be a guy who's involved on really 10 to 12 touches per game. I'm not ready to drop Dylan Samson yet, that's for sure. Jonathan Brooks is a guy I didn't think was going to make this list. You could go back to a video I made basically 2 years ago about Trey Benson versus Jonathan Brooks, and I definitely favored Trey Benson then, and I still favor Trey Benson now. Now, the irony is both of these guys have done basically nothing. Jonathan Brooks obviously did not play in his sophomore season in 2025 because he got a re-suffered knee tear. So it's like Jonathan Brooks, he couldn't have had a worse start to his NFL career. So I do think that there's a lot of merit to being like, hey, listen, why don't you just cut bait? It doesn't look like the Carolina Panthers are going to be utilizing him as their lead back for sure moving forward. But I think this comes back to the draft capital discussion. When you took Jonathan Brooks in rookie drafts, what did you pay for him? In all likelihood, a mid to late first round pick. So I do believe that Jonathan Brooks should still be on your roster because at the very least, let the guy play a little bit. And he is expected to be back in 2026. Now, if anything changes on that front, I think at that point, you just have to say the guy's career is officially wasted. But we're not at that point yet, I don't think. I think he still has time to make his mark and to give you a little bit of draft capital or some sort of value back from him in a potential trade in the next year or so. Now, Caleb Johnson is another guy that I think is really funny to talk about here because Caleb Johnson was irrelevant this year. Like the Pittsburgh Steelers used a third-round pick on the guy, and he was basically just a no-show for the majority of it. And you can actually look back to when they started not dressing him for games, and it was the moment that he was just like, oh, I'm going to let the kickoff go back to the end zone and not touch it. You can't do that. So they were pissed at him for that. And he was very much on the sidelines, not even in uniform for the majority of the season after that. So I think that with the coaching staff ultimately being turned over in a massive way, you can't look at last season and say that is Caleb Johnson. I think if it was still Mike Tomlin and he still had the same coaching staff, you could definitely say I've got major concerns and I want to aboard ship. Just abort with Caleb Johnson. But with Mike McCarthy coming in, we have no idea what he's going to prefer. I've already seen reports that Kenneth Gainwell might be on the out. So Jaylen Warren, if it is going to be him and Caleb Johnson will be more involved. So again, very similar to Brooks. I'm not ready to let him go and just cut the guy when I spent probably a late first, early second round pick on him, and we haven't even seen the guy play yet. It just is not smart dynasty roster management. Now, Bill Krosky, Ja'Cory Krosky Merritt, is a guy that I kind of struggle with here because I actually ended up cutting him in one of my shallower dynasty leagues. And I do regret it to a certain extent because he's now on a rivals team, and I do think that he has potential. And that's the reason I ultimately would say to you, probably don't cut him unless you're just in a super, super shallow league because Bill Krosky is a guy that showed enough. And again, it's very similar to the Jets argument. When you look at the Washington Commanders and all the needs that they need to fill defensively and offensively, running back really isn't towards the top of the list if they found Bill Krosky to be a guy that could handle more of a load in the future. Now, that's not to say they won't add running backs. I actually believe they will add a running back, and Ja'Cory Krosky Merritt was just a late-round pick. And typically, historically, those guys don't get the favor from a new coaching staff or a new offensive coordinator. They just don't have much attachment to him. So I do ultimately think Bill Krosky probably is going to be second fiddle next year, but I do think at this point, without free agency playing out, it's probably a little premature to drop Bill Krosky. But if they do add someone big, like a Kenneth Walker or a Breece Hall in free agency, I would say at that point, Bill Krosky probably doesn't have a ton of value. Kenneth Gainwell is also very interesting, actually. Kenneth Gainwell turned out to be a great fantasy addition for a lot of teams if you had the stones to play him. Now, a lot of people did not because Kenneth Gainwell was a lot of times either boom or bust. And if he busted, it was for like 2 points. If he boomed, It was for about 31 points. I do think Kenneth Gainwell is going to move out of Pittsburgh this year. Because of the new coaching staff, Mike McCarthy being an offensive guy, he's going to have his own vision of what things should look like on the offensive side of the ball. And I don't think Kenneth Gainwell fits in there when they have a third-round pick, Caleb Johnson, and they just signed Jaylen Warren to a contract extension. Kenneth Gainwell probably the odd man out in that offense. But I do not think that he's just going to be some career third-string guy. I think he will continue to be involved in any offense that he's a part of in a big way as a pass-catching running back and a change of pace back. And therefore, I do still think he has fantasy value. So let's just see what happens over free agency, what the next team is going to be, and what the situation looks like from a coaching and a scheme perspective. Now, Tuten is the next guy that I want to talk about here, and he's obviously a guy that didn't do too much this year, but did have a little bit of relevance at certain points. I do ultimately think that Travis Etienne could be gone from the Jacksonville Jaguars this year. And if you look at two different things, number one, Travis Etienne was not a Liam Cohen draft pick. So you do have to factor that into the decision that they ultimately could make come free agency. Number two, Tuten was a draft pick by Liam Cohen. A fourth-round pick, but he still was a draft pick by Liam Cohen. So he does ultimately fit the system that Cohen wants to run. And I do think that we saw enough from him to potentially be a running back who is getting 12 to 15 touches per game. I'm not even sure if Liam Cohen wants to have a predominant number one in the offense, which is kind of the reason why I would say keep Tuten, because it's not that I think Tuten is going to be a 3-down back for Jacksonville, but I think whoever is back, whether they bring Travis Etienne back or they bring in another running back, I do believe Tuten will have involvement and will have value in deeper dynasty leagues. J.K. Dobbins is another name I would hold on to still. J.K. Dobbins and the Denver Broncos, I do think will ultimately be together for one more year at the very least. J.K. Dobbins has already expressed that he wants to be back in Denver. I would imagine Denver probably wants to keep him around too, because the drop-off from R.J. Harvey from J.K. Dobbins actually was a lot steeper than a lot of people think. From fantasy value, obviously, R.J. Harvey did fine. He was a touchdown guy. He was a pass catcher. A lot of things that went well with R.J. Harvey were not what his efficiency was on the ground. J.K. Dobbins is a much better runner at this point of his career than R.J. Harvey is. So I ultimately do think Denver will keep J.K. Dobbins around. And for that reason, you could have a starting running back. And if you do drop him, someone else is going to be able to pick up a starting running back off the wire for free because you dropped him. Now, the last two guys are two rookies as well. Kyle Monangai and Devin Neal at the running back position. Kyle Monangai, I discussed this a couple weeks ago. There's a lot of history that would go against Monangai. The guy was a 7th-round pick. There's typically, running backs who are picked that late don't have any stock with their team, but I do think that he fits the Ben Johnson mold that he wants to utilize. I think he's the David Montgomery of that offense from when Ben Johnson was in Detroit, and I think that the upgrade that Ben Johnson would rather make was with the more electric guy in DeAndre Swift's role. I do think Swift at this point is probably a potential cap casualty. Not that he was a bad player, but just from a roster building perspective, I actually think there's a lot more juice to the idea that DeAndre Swift could be the odd man out in the offense than Kyle Monangai. So let's just see what happens. I would rather hold Kyle Monangai for now, though, because you do want pieces of the Chicago running attack. Devin Neal is the last guy on here. Alvin Kamara very well could be out the door this offseason. And I do think we saw enough from Devin Neal from a rushing and a pass-catching perspective for the team to keep him involved and keep him around. Now, are they going to make him their starting 3-down running back? Probably not, but I do think he will have involvement if they do get rid of Alvin Kamara and they do move on towards the future. And I do kind of expect them to do that with another year of Kellen Moore and building that offense that actually has sneaky potential and sneaky upside for fantasy football moving forward. Now, if you do want to see where all these guys are ranked in my Dynasty rankings, all of my Dynasty rankings are up to date on my site, fsroundup.com. With an Outfitter subscription, you can gain access to my full 320 Dynasty rankings right now. So make sure to go utilize that. Go utilize the articles on our site for Dynasty purposes. There's tons of good stuff going on fsroundup.com right now from a Dynasty perspective. Now let's move into the wide receiver position right here. And I think I want to start with Romeo Doubs, who I may have covered in a different video. And really the main point here is that Romeo Doubs is a free agent. So Romeo Doubs actually has a chance to become way more fantasy relevant than he has been. I don't think that he's going to become some sort of Drake London type of player. What I do think he could be is a Jacoby Myers type of player or a Cortland Sutton type of player, to where he could be in that wide receiver 15 to 20 category if a team views him as their wide receiver 1. Because if he stays in Green Bay, it's probably more of the same, which is around wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 territory, and he has some sort of involvement and relevancy from a week-to-week basis. But I do think if he leaves and he gets paid to be someone's number 1, I do think that we could be looking at a very high upside Romeo Doubs relative to how the rest of his career has gone. So I would rather wait, see how free agency plays out before I drop him. Alec Pierce is another name that is a free agent as well. Now, if he stays in Indianapolis, I still think he has relevancy, and I don't think I would drop him, but I would rather him go somewhere else. And the reason is because Indianapolis' quarterback situation is so up in the air. I would rather him go to a bigger armed quarterback where we know there's going to be plenty of deep shots in the future for one of those types of guys. I would rather him go to a place like New England, for example, with Drake May. I'd rather him go to Seattle, for example, with Sam Darnold. Those are just two quarterbacks off the top of my head because it's Super Bowl week. But ultimately, the whole point of the matter is I do think Alec Pierce, if he moves on from Indianapolis, probably has more upside than if he were to stay in Indy. But either way, I actually think of Alec Pierce as one of those guys that should not be dropped regardless. And speaking of Patriots deep shots, Kyle Williams, I'm not ready to give up on him just yet. I think I'm very attached to what you paid to get a certain player. And when you look at the draft capital that it cost to get Kyle Williams, it probably was in that range where it makes no sense to cut him after 1 year. And I get it. He wasn't very involved this year except on a couple deep shots. You got to give this one a little bit of time to bake. Stephon Diggs is an older player. Kayshon Boutte, who knows what the future holds with him. Mac Hollins, that guy is an older player as well. Who knows what the future holds with him as well. Kyle Williams is 1 or 2 players away from being very involved in this offense. My advice is just wait this one out, see how free agency plays out, see how the draft plays out, before you even think about dropping a player that's this young and this high upside of an offense right here. Jayden Reed. I do think this is probably the first offseason people are considering cutting Jayden Reed, because the first couple of years of his career, he's actually been pretty good. This year was a disappointment. Obviously, he's been injured for the majority of the season, and when he came back, he really didn't do anything of value. So I do think this is probably the first offseason where things could change and people could consider dropping Jayden Reed. I would not do that because, once again, Romeo Doubs is a free agent. Dontavian Wicks on his last year of his contract. Matthew Golden maybe is ready in his sophomore year, maybe is not the player they once thought he was when they drafted him. Either way, I think Jayden Reed, with a full healthy offseason, is going to come back and probably be either the number 1 or the number 2 in this offense. I think dropping Jayden Reed right now would just be a dumb move that doesn't have much forethought to it on how the 2026 season will actually play out. Torrey Horton is the next wide receiver I'm definitely holding, because I discussed Torrey Horton on one of the stash videos I made. I think he's a very interesting player to stash. Look at their wide receiver core right now. Cooper Kupp, well past his prime. Rashid Shaheed on a 1 year, he's on the last year of his deal. So that means that Torrey Horton is going to be stepping into the offense in a very big role in all likelihood come next year. And if you looked at what happened with Torrey Horton, is that this guy, when he was healthy in Seattle, was actually their Rashid Shaheed before they had Rashid Shaheed. Except I would argue he was actually a better receiver for them. Now, when he went down, that's when they traded for Rashid Shaheed, because they knew they needed that explosive element in the punt returning game and also on the receiving element as well. I think Torrey Horton will come back and be continuously involved in this offense moving forward. I definitely am holding Torrey Horton. Calvin Ridley is an interesting name to talk about. This guy is in his 30s with the Tennessee Titans, but he's been a massive disappointment since he returned from that suspension several years ago. What has he done that's really been fantasy relevant on a consistent basis? I get it. With Jacksonville, he actually had a pretty good year. With Tennessee, though, 2 mediocre seasons, and then he obviously went down early and did not play the entirety of the season. Here's my thing. I really like what the coaching staff is built of now with Robert Saleh as head coach and with Brian Daboll as the offensive coordinator. I actually really like that coaching staff. So my opinion is this. Let's wait to see if Calvin Ridley is a cut candidate in Tennessee. Because in theory, if you look at his contract, they do have an out with him this year. They could get out and minimize their dead cap. Let's see what happens. If he ends up getting dropped, I probably would drop him because that would signal the end of his career, or even maybe not the end, but definitely close to the end. So let's see if he gets cut. If he doesn't get cut, I want to keep Calvin Ridley for one more year to see how he could do in a Brian Daboll offense with another year of Cam Ward. And then Isaiah Bond. It's interesting because it's very much like the Dylan Samson thing. I actually low-key kind of like Todd Monken in Cleveland. Not to say that they're going to be some dominant operation. What I do think will happen, though, is that the offense will be more efficient. And that actually kind of sounds counterintuitive because a lot of people think Kevin Stefanski is really good. I actually kind of think he's a little overrated. But my point ultimately is that Isaiah Bond, with another year of whoever the quarterback is, I think is going to be a better system. And if you look at the wide receivers like Cedric Tillman and Jerry Jeudy, who knows if one of those two guys ultimately gets moved. So I kind of want to hold on to Isaiah Bond. Let's see what happens in free agency. Let's see what happens in the draft. I do think Isaiah Bond has potential value because keep in mind, if the guy did not have a bunch of allegations towards him during the draft process, he probably would have been a day 2 pick because he actually is a pretty good talent. Now, here's 2 quarterbacks and tight ends that I want to hold on to as well. And there may be more on the list, but these 2 guys, to me, come front of mind. Kyler Murray and Elijah Arroyo. So Kyler Murray, the reason I'm including him here is because in one of my dynasty leagues, that is a super flex, super deep league, someone had the audacity to drop Kyler Murray. Of course, I went and picked him up because it sounds so dumb to me why you would drop Kyler Murray. If you look at the guy's contract, they have tons of dead cap if they were to drop him this year. So either they find a trade partner for him or he's staying on that roster. Now in 2027, we can have a different conversation. But at this point in time, it's either he's going to be on that roster or he's going to be traded. Either way, this player has way too much value from a fantasy perspective to just let go on the waiver wire. Now, if he stays in Arizona, they probably don't utilize him as their starting quarterback. So that's not to say that you should be ready to start him and plug him in next year. I think he should be more of a third quarterback type of option. But I do ultimately think if you were in a deep enough league to hold Kyler Murray, you could get a massive return if he gets traded to somewhere like the Jets. Not that they're going to be good with him, but he definitely will provide fantasy value because he can still move. And that's the bottom line of this. Elijah Arroyo. In Seattle this year, A.J. Barner definitely took over. I will say, though, they spent a second-round pick on Elijah Arroyo, and I don't think he's done. I think very similar to Torrey Horton, he was building momentum, and then he got injured. Let's see what happens with a full offseason. Do they move off of A.J. Barner, or do they continue to utilize both of them in the passing game? If that happens, I would bet that Elijah Arroyo is able to move up the pecking order in the depth chart and start being more involved on a weekly basis. I'm holding him right now. So let me know who your guy is that you are not moving off of in 2026. And if you want to see a full film breakdown on Jeremiah Love, click on this video right here.